Hello class, Instructor Bings here, and this is the supplemental video covering chapter 18 that will be posted on Tuesday, February 4th, which is today. So I'm going to try to make this as quickly, I'm going to try to make this as short as possible. And we can touch on it tomorrow during review and fill in some gaps that might not be covered. So if you have questions, bring those with you tomorrow. So let's just jump right in. This outline will be, this chapter 18 outline will be posted today on the home page along with this outline, but remember that chapters 16, 17, and 18 are all a part of this section called Growing Pains, which is part 5 of the textbook. And remember, I'm using one word to describe each. Well, for us, it's nice and tidy because we do it for each chapter. But these descriptions are also the growing pains that our nation was experiencing during the Gilded Age. So we talked about industrialization. We talked about expansion that is within the nation, the New South, the New West, and then the European Americans clashing with the Native Americans. The word for chapter 18 is immigration. There's 2 points to this. Immigration from the country to the city, and then immigration from countries, plural, other countries, to the United States. So let's look at immigration from rural America, the country, the farmland, to the cities, the big cities in America. In 1790, a little over 5% of Americans lived in cities. So we were dominantly agricultural, 95%, excuse me. 80 years later, shortly after the end of the Civil War, during Reconstruction, 1/4 of our population, 25.7%, now lived in the cities. Still dominantly agricultural, but a 20% increase as far as those who live in cities. And remember, the population in 1870, the overall United States population would be much greater than it was in 1790. Let's look at this immigration from the country to the city. And these slides will be also put up today. Here's another statistic about the growth of city dwellers. In 1850, so 20 years before the statistic we just saw, that 25% of Americans lived in a city, just 20 years before that, in 1850, only 15% of Americans lived in cities. By 1900, it had gone up to 40%. So in that 50-year gap, it increased 25%. And from the 1870 figure of 25%, it had increased 15%. Why were the cities growing? several factors. People from the farmland were moving in, and then you had several thousand immigrants coming to the United States. Here's a slide that shows a reason for people who lived on farms coming to the city. There was great improvement in the technology of farm machinery, which meant you didn't need as much labor. So many rural people were no longer needed on the farms, and they couldn't find jobs, and so they moved to the cities to find work. And you will recall that in the cities, industries were cropping up all over the place. Factories, mills. So the continental immigration, that is the migration on our continent from the south to the northeast, or from the south to the west, a big factor in that was technology advances in farm equipment. Cut out a lot of need for human laborers. Also, there were a lot of jobs in the cities with the Industrial Revolution, the Second Industrial Revolution. Of course, a lot of African Americans were among those who immigrated. Here's another slide that gives you an idea of how many people, how the population of cities was increasing. In 1890, 33% of Americans. In 1920, 50% of Americans lived in the United States. That's 100 years ago. Factory jobs sparked an increase. We talked about that, the Industrial Revolution. Cities provided machine-made jobs, higher wages, and the monotony of farm life was able to be overcome. But how many people would go and work in a factory and they would be on a assembly line or some kind of system where they were standing at the same station all day long? So they thought they were escaping monotony or boredom, only to come to a place, factories, where they could be monotonous again. Job opportunities were available for women in the cities. This is a changing trend. Women usually were in the sphere of the home. That was their place of work. But with more jobs in the cities, it gave more opportunity for women. Women did the bulk of school teaching, domestic services, cleaning house, being maids, being nannies, things like that. Women doctors, and these professions here, lawyers and doctors, would be a low percentage, but typists, telephone workers, librarians, journalists. So job opportunities for women. This is a graph of the population that shows urbanization from 1790 to 2000. Remember, 5% of Americans lived in the city in 1790. We talked about how it went up to 40% by 1900. 1920, it was half of the United States. And then in the 80-year period from 1920 to 2000, 77% of Americans lived in cities, and now it's been 20 years since then. I'll try to find a statistic, but I would not be surprised if we are now over 80% of Americans living in cities. All right, hello there again. So that was the increase of percentages. Who were the people that were immigrating within the United States? Well, again, you had former slaves moving out of the South and into cities to find work. You had poor whites also coming from the South and other farm areas because they were no longer needed on the farms. You still had, remember we talked about yesterday, you still had those seeking their fortunes in the West, and they were leaving primarily the Northeast and going west and settling in San Francisco and other big cities to try to find gold and silver. So that was the in-country migration. And then you had another third group, immigrants from other countries. When they usually came to the United States, they would migrate to the big cities, and you'd have clusters of ethnic groups, for example, Italians and Jews in Manhattan, and then Chinese in San Francisco. So now with that, we're going to jump to this second point about immigration. People coming from foreign countries to the United States. During the 50-year period from 1840 to 1890, we had 15 million immigrants come to the United States. The majority of these immigrants were from Northern and Western European countries. Places like England and Ireland, Germany and Scandinavia. They were, as far as their religious affiliation, they were primarily Protestants, Protestant Christians. You have three dominant Christian groups to this day: Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, and Protestant. So the immigrants, got to get more sleep. The immigrants from this 50-year period, coming from those Northern and Western European countries, were primarily Protestant. They came from countries that had similar governments to ours, governments that were constitutional, and they had a high literacy rate. They were able to read. From 1880, so you can see there's a 10-year transitioning period from 1880 to 1890. But from 1880 to 1921, 70% of immigrants during this generation came from no longer if you look on this map here, no longer these Northern and Western European countries, but they came from Southern and Western European countries. Places like Italy and Russia, Austria, Poland. These were called new immigrants. The group from here were the old immigrants. The new immigrants, you can see here, were typically younger males. Religiously, they were Roman Catholics or Eastern Orthodox or Jewish people. So the Protestant influx of immigrants had greatly decreased, and now we're getting more Catholics and Jewish people and Eastern Orthodox people. And they speak little or no English, not as literate as the old immigrants, and they have a very fierce family loyalty, so that they would come and basically live together in big cities. And so you have these areas in these big cities where you have Chicago is a prime example, where you have the whole metropolitan city of Chicago is, you can find a map of inner city Chicago and actually the whole city of Chicago and see the different boroughs where there's an Italian neighborhood, a Polish neighborhood, a German neighborhood, an African American neighborhood. So these new immigrants really did not assimilate as easily as the old immigrants. Got a couple more slides here that give descriptions of these things. There's the 1840 to 1880 group, the old immigrants, 1890 to 1914. They're also from countries that are not like the United States. They're more autocratic countries, so they're not accustomed to constitutional government. The older immigrants assimilated well with the natives that already lived here. And when I say natives, I'm not talking about Native American Indians. We're talking about the European Americans that are already here because of their ancestors having immigrated here in the 16 and 1700s. These natives were very anti-immigrant, and they are called nativists. It's a movement called nativism, which ensures that natural-born Americans received better treatment than immigrants. And for the most part, Americans still believe that way today. That's why our current president has been very popular with half the country, because he seems to be doing what he said he would do, and that would to put America first. This is another slide on the new immigrants. And along with the Southern and Western European immigrants, you had immigrants from Mexico and China. The Chinese usually came, and they did not come through New York, through Ellis Island. They usually came across the Pacific and came into San Francisco at Angel Island. And that's why you have a large Chinese population in San Francisco. And a lot of the Chinese people worked for the railroads in the West. So, but you had immigrants coming from these other countries. Here we go, Ellis Island versus Angel Island. This is when America really was experiencing what we've heard called the melting pot, where people from all nations are coming in and just being not assimilate because they were harder to assimilate, but the population as a whole was becoming more of a melting pot because you had all of these different groups now. Now getting them to mix together and assimilate was another thing. Here's a neighborhood in Brooklyn in Manhattan that shows you how you have Hungarians living here. You have Polish here, Russians here, Middle Eastern and Romanian, and then just Romanian here. Many American nativists disliked the new immigrants because they would not assimilate into American society. They would stay segregated in their ethnic neighborhoods. We see this happening today with people still flying people who have immigrated here still flying the flag of their home country. Back to the outline, and we'll finish up. So this was the immigration of foreign countries or foreigners, foreign immigrants to the United States during the Gilded Age. So just think of the whole nation during this time as immigration within the continent, people moving from the south to the west and the northeast, and even up into the Midwest. And that includes both Caucasian and African Americans. People still migrating out west. So all this movement's going on within the country. And then just imagine in your head the United States with both oceans on each end, the Atlantic and the Pacific, and just picture immigrants coming across the oceans. And so they're coming in while the movement's going on within. And this was a growing pain for America during the Gilded Age. Not only are ethnic populations shifting within the country, but they're increasing with the influx of immigrants. And I told you that 15 million immigrants came into America from 1840 to 1890. Well, from 1891 to 1920, another 18 million came in. So this is just really a huge growing pain for our country. And so we're going to stop there. I will touch briefly tomorrow because I want to have the majority of the time to review. But I'll touch on the changing of the whole American culture, which we call urbanization. And we'll touch a little bit on the political scene. Then we'll have a thorough review where I will share with you the topics that you need to know for the test, so you won't have to worry about navigating through all of the material in all 4 chapters during the next 3 days of the test. You can know where to go in each chapter. So we'll do that tomorrow. Hope you have a great evening. To my How peeps out there, I don't think I'm going to make it tonight, so I apologize for not making it to the game. But have a great evening, and we will see you tomorrow at 1 p.m. Bye-bye.